It was shortly after 10 o'clock on a damp and colourless morning in March when I heard the brisk tapping of Holmes's pipe against the window pane of our sitting room at 221 B. Baker Street. The fog outside had only half lifted, turning the street below into a pale grey blur. I had just sat down with a medical journal when the bell rang, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Her brows lifted in that quiet way which, over time, I had come to interpret as a sign of curious contents. Holmes did not rise, but extended a hand without turning from the window. As he read, the edges of his mouth tugged into that familiar expression, a mixture of amusement and engagement that always heralded the onset of a case. He handed it to me silently. The message read, "A gunshot. Nobody. No weapon. In the chapel. Come at once. St. Jude's, Clerkenwell." There was no signature, but Holmes seemed to know precisely who it was from. "We are being summoned not to solve a murder," he murmured, tapping ash into a nearby teacup, "but to locate one, or rather to determine whether one has occurred at all." "Surely a gunshot in a church at dawn is no trivial matter," I remarked. "On the contrary," Holmes replied, rising at last to fetch his coat. "It may be one of the most exquisitely perplexing invitations we've received in some weeks." In less than 20 minutes, we were clattering through Clerkenwell in a hansom cab, the horses' hooves muffled by the lingering wet. St. Jude's, as we approached it, stood modest and unassuming, its weathered grey stone and squat bell tower nestled between rows of terraced brick buildings. At the front gate awaited a tall, lean man in clerical black, whose hands twisted anxiously behind his back. "You must be Mr. Holmes," he said, offering a swift bow. "I'm Reverend Merriman, the vicar here. I wasn't certain what to do. I debated summoning Scotland Yard, but something about the matter seemed not criminal in the ordinary sense." Holmes inclined his head. "You did well, Reverend. Tell us exactly what occurred." "This morning, just after 6, Merriman began, "our verger, Mr. Enfield, came to unlock the church as usual. He was walking through the side aisle when he heard a loud crack, unmistakably a gunshot, reverberating through the nave. He rushed toward the sound but found no one, nobody, no signs of struggle, no weapon. Only silence." "Did he smell powder?" Holmes asked. "He claims he did. Said it brought back memories of the Crimea." "Interesting," Holmes said, his eyes flicking toward the arched doorway of the chapel. "And the church had been locked the night before?" "Thoroughly. I checked the doors myself after choir practice. No signs of forced entry this morning, and I myself was in the vicarage next door all night. Heard nothing." Holmes turned to me. "Come, Watson. Let us meet the verger." Mr. Enfield was a stout man in his 60s with bristling white whiskers and an expression of nervous pride. He took us inside, where the air was cool and musty, and the filtered light from stained glass windows dappled the flagstone floor. "I was walking just there," he said, pointing to a spot beside the front pews. "And the sound came from up near the altar. Echoed something awful. Did you see anyone? Anything out of place?" "Not a soul. But the air, there was a sharpness to it like the edge of burnt powder." Holmes nodded absently, already walking up the center aisle. I followed behind him, watching as he paused here and there, bending to inspect the floor, tapping a finger along the edge of a pillar, running a gloved hand across the back of the pews. At the chancel step, he stopped and stooped low, retrieving something from the shadows beneath the choir stall. He held it up to the light, a torn scrap of yellowed paper, no larger than a playing card. "Curious," he murmured. I moved closer. Scrawled in faded ink were the words, "The seal must not be broken, for what lies be—" The sentence ended in a jagged tear. "Biblical?" I asked. "Possibly." Though I suspect more occult than ecclesiastical, Holmes folded the fragment carefully and placed it in his pocket. "What else is there, Reverend?" The vicar hesitated. "This may be nothing, but the vestry door was ajar this morning. It is normally locked, and I found this just inside." He held out a small brass object, an empty shell casing, glinting faintly in the light. "Fired recently," Holmes said at once, examining it. ".32 caliber, likely American manufacture." Merriman nodded. "There was also a visitor last Thursday, a woman, American, I believe. She asked about a tombstone, Eliza Breward. Said she was tracing her ancestors. I thought little of it at the time. She left abruptly. Did she find what she was looking for?" "She claimed she did. But she dropped something, a paper fan with a silver handle. I returned it to her lodging house near Russell Square." Holmes seemed particularly interested in this detail. "And you remember her name?" "Miss Florence Lyle." He turned abruptly. "We'll need her address." "And a full list of those with keys to the church." We returned to Baker Street by midday. Holmes did not sit nor speak for some time. He paced slowly before the fireplace, occasionally removing the casing from his pocket and holding it up against the light as though expecting it to reveal its secrets. "A gun discharged in a locked church," he said at last. "No victim, no culprit, but a trace of gunpowder and a woman researching a grave." "You believe she fired the shot?" "I believe someone wished for a sound to be heard," he said, eyes narrowing. "And not by accident. The question is, why fire a shot that strikes no one? And why in a place meant for prayer?" Holmes smiled faintly, turning toward the door. "Because, Watson, the sacred has always been the perfect hiding place for the profane. Let us find Miss Florence Lyle before the trail cools." The fog had thickened by the time we arrived at Russell Square, swirling in lazy tendrils along the iron railings and cloaking the facades of the townhouses in pale mystery. Holmes led the way without hesitation, consulting neither map nor address slip. His memory for the city's geography rivaled that of any cabman. We stopped before a modest 3-story lodging house with ivy curling over the upper balconies and a brass plaque beside the door. Mrs. Blevins' boarding establishment. Holmes rang the bell, and we waited in silence. Presently, a small, tight-lipped woman opened the door, her graying hair drawn into a severe bun and her spectacles hanging from a chain around her neck. "Good day," Holmes said, doffing his hat with faint courtesy. "We are hoping to speak with Miss Florence Lyle." "Is she in residence?" The landlady pursed her lips. "Miss Lyle left yesterday." Unexpectedly, Holmes's expression did not change, but I noted the flicker of interest in his eyes. "Left, you say?" "Permanently. She paid through the week but asked for her trunk to be kept in storage. Said she would send for it. Did she mention where she was going?" Mrs. Blevins sniffed. "Only that it was outside the city. I didn't pry, though I dare say she was troubled." "Troubled how?" Holmes asked softly. "She seemed frightened, Mr. Holmes." "Not the kind of fear that makes one scream, but the kind that makes one glance over the shoulder too often. There was something always on her mind, and the fan." "I returned it to her personally," the landlady replied, nodding. "She seemed surprised I had it and quite distressed. Thanked me profusely, then shut the door without another word." Holmes handed her a card. "Should she write or return for her belongings, I ask you to notify me at once." Back in the street, Holmes paused under a gas lamp and lit a cigarette with an absent air. "She's gone to ground," he murmured. "Either she feared for her life or for her secret. Do you believe she fired the gun?" "I believe she was present when it was fired," he said, "but whether as victim, witness, or accomplice remains unclear. The absence of a body implies the shot was intended to startle or to mark something." "To mark. A sound can be a message, Watson. A gunshot in an empty church is not a crime. It is a statement. But what it intends to announce is the mystery we must unravel." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately set about consulting his personal archives, a vast collection of clipped notices, court records, and correspondence that filled half the shelves in our study. I busied myself with a modest lunch and was midway through a cold beef sandwich when he exclaimed softly and drew a page from a manila folder. "Eliza Breward," he said, tapping the name. "Buried at St. Jude's in 1858. A spinster, died in her sleep. No known family." I glanced at the record. A commonplace death. Indeed, Holmes agreed. But look at the column beside it. She left a sealed will, unopened until her estate was claimed, and he flipped another page. That estate was never claimed. Not by anyone. Do you suspect Miss Lyle is a descendant? Or a pretender? Holmes replied, his voice dry. In either case, something in that tomb or in that will has brought her across the Atlantic. That evening, Lestrade of Scotland Yard arrived in response to Holmes's earlier telegram. He was in his usual good humor, though the damp had curled his mustache into a shape resembling a question mark. "You're always dragging me into these theological dramas, Holmes," he grumbled. "I prefer the honest company of burglars." Holmes waved him to a chair. "Tell me, Lestrade, what do you know of American arms circulating in London?" The inspector blinked. "Illegal imports?" "Some. Nothing widespread." Holmes retrieved the shell casing from his coat pocket. .32 caliber, fired in a consecrated space. No witnesses, no damage, no death. "Does it interest you?" Lestrade examined it. "Colt revolver, I'd wager. Expensive. That's no street thug's weapon. You say it was found in the church?" "Near the vestry." "And a woman? American, nervous, vanishes shortly thereafter." "I am pursuing her." Lestrade grunted. "Do you want a man on her trail?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet." "The spider's web is still taking shape." Lestrade's brow furrowed. "You think there's danger?" Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled. "I think the past is about to issue a claim on the present, and someone, perhaps several someones, intend to bury it deeper." After Lestrade departed, Holmes grew unusually quiet. He sat by the fire, not reading, not smoking, merely watching the flames. I knew better than to interrupt such moments. When he did speak, it was with the softness of a man following the faintest of threads. "There is a rhythm, Watson," he said. "First, a woman searches for a grave. Then a message is fired into silence. Next." "A second message?" I asked. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he stood and crossed to the window, drawing the curtain aside. "Tomorrow," he said, "we return to St. Jude's." "But not by daylight. Why?" "Because if someone wanted to fire a shot unseen, Watson, they may also wish to retrieve something under the cover of night, and I intend to be waiting." It was not yet midnight when we returned to Clerkenwell. The fog had thickened into a pale blanket, wrapping around lamp-posts and muffling the sound of our footsteps. Holmes had chosen dark clothing and a soft cap rather than his usual hat, and he moved with the light tread of a man who had paced more alleyways than drawing rooms. I followed closely, my revolver discreetly tucked in my coat pocket, though I hoped fervently we would not need it. St. Jude's loomed ahead, silent and hunched against the night like a sleeping sentinel. The old stones glistened faintly under the gaslight, and the nave's arched windows, dark and opaque, gave no sign of movement within. Holmes paused near the side gate, examining the iron lock with quiet interest. "It was relatched recently," he murmured. "The bolt has scraped fresh rust." "Someone's been here since this morning." "Indeed." And not with a vicar's key, Holmes produced a small tool from his coat, something between a stiletto and a lockpick, and within seconds the gate gave a reluctant groan. We slipped inside, boots silent on the dew-slicked path, and made our way to a side entrance near the vestry. Holmes lifted his finger to his lips and listened intently. There was no sound save the distant creak of tree branches and the faint drip of condensation falling from guttering. Then, very faintly, the soft scrape of something metallic against stone. We froze. Holmes gestured, and we crept forward. From the darkness beyond the door came a shifting shape, just a silhouette at first. Someone was crouched near the front pews, hunched over with a lantern held low. The figure moved slowly, scanning the ground. Holmes stepped forward abruptly. A risky hour for devotion. The figure startled violently, the lantern slipping in their grasp. It tumbled and clattered across the stone floor, casting erratic shadows as it rolled. "Don't come closer," a woman's voice cried out, panicked. "Miss Lyle," Holmes asked, his tone unthreatening but precise. There was a pause, then a slow exhale. The woman straightened from the floor, holding her hands where we could see them. She was cloaked in a dark shawl, and her face, when the lantern's light caught it, was drawn and pale. "You followed me," she said quietly. "I anticipated your return," Holmes replied. "You left too many threads dangling. The fan, the church, the gunshot. It was only a matter of time." She looked away, shame or perhaps defiance flickering across her face. I had no choice. I had to see if it was true. Holmes approached cautiously. "What truth is it you seek, Miss Lyle?" She was silent for a long moment. Then she turned her eyes to Holmes, and I saw a determination there that no longer resembled fear. "Eliza Breward was my grandmother," she said. "She left America in 1853 under difficult circumstances. My father was raised by guardians in Boston who told him almost nothing about his mother, but among her possessions was a letter, sealed in wax, never opened, marked only with the initials E.B. and the address of this church." "And you came to discover what it meant?" Holmes asked. "I came to see her grave, to know if she had died in peace. But the moment I found it, I felt watched. I left, but I couldn't let it go." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "You fired the gun?" Her expression hardened. "No, but someone did. I returned that morning before dawn, hoping to slip inside again. I was near the side when I heard it. A shot, loud and unmistakable. I panicked and ran, yet you returned tonight. Knowing it may be dangerous, I'm not frightened of the dead, Mr. Holmes. Only of what they may have hidden." Holmes tilted his head. "What were you searching for just now?" She hesitated. "A mark. The letter mentioned a seal. Not metaphorical, I think. Something physical. Something she left." Holmes turned away briefly, considering her words. Then he beckoned to me. "Watson, bring your lamp. Let us inspect the grave." We crossed the nave to the side aisle, where a row of simple headstones flanked the inner wall. Miss Lyle guided us to the last one in the row, weathered and half-covered in moss. The inscription, though faded, was still legible. "Eliza Breward, 1821 to 1858. The light shall find thee, though buried deep." Holmes knelt beside the stone, brushing away the moss with his sleeve. He ran his fingers along the edges of the stone, then tapped gently along the side. A dull thud answered each strike, until he reached the base. "Hollow," he muttered. "Watson, your blade." I handed him my penknife, and he inserted it delicately into a barely perceptible seam along the plinth. With a faint click, a thin slate panel loosened, revealing a narrow cavity behind it. From within, Holmes extracted a slim brass tube, sealed at both ends with wax. It bore no markings, save for the initials E.B. engraved in the metal. The wax was intact, unbroken for nearly 40 years. Miss Lyle gasped. "That's it. That must be it." Holmes examined it closely. "We will not open it here. Too many unknowns, but—" "Miss Lyle," Holmes said not unkindly, "if someone fired a shot in this church to warn you away, they may do more than warn next time. This document's contents may be valuable, legally, financially, or otherwise. Until we understand its implications, it must remain sealed." She nodded reluctantly. Holmes rose and turned toward me. "We are no longer looking for a murderer, Watson. We are looking for a motive worth killing for." "And if that tube contains it?" I asked. "Then Miss Lyle is in far greater danger than she knows." Behind us, the fog pressed once more against the stained glass windows. In the silence of the empty church, the discovery sat between us. Fragile, forgotten, and possibly deadly. We returned to Baker Street just before 2 in the morning. Miss Lyle sat silently opposite the hearth, her shawl still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The brass tube lay unopened on the mantel, resting beside Holmes's violin and a cold teapot. Holmes himself stood at the window, his silhouette framed against the pale haze of gaslight from the street below. I broke the silence at last. "You believe someone is watching her?" Even now Holmes did not turn. They may not know she retrieved it tonight, or they may have suspected she would and intend to act accordingly. Miss Lyle's voice was soft but steady. You think someone would harm me over that document? I think, Holmes said slowly, that someone has already killed, or intends to kill, not out of passion or revenge, but to bury something connected to this. He tapped the tube lightly with his finger. We must tread with care. She looked toward the hearth, her eyes reflecting the flame's flicker. I didn't come to England seeking trouble. I only wanted to know if my grandmother had meant to leave something behind. She vanished from our family's story. This was a whisper through time. Holmes turned then, his gaze sharp but not unkind, and perhaps it was never meant to be heard. He stepped to his writing desk and selected a small scalpel from the tray of instruments. We shall open it, but we shall do so in full light, with copies made immediately. If the contents are what I suspect, we may be dealing with a matter not merely of family inheritance, but of criminal conspiracy stretching back decades. I leaned in as Holmes broke the wax seal with a careful hand. The faintest hiss escaped as air entered the old brass chamber. Inside was a tightly rolled sheet of parchment, aged but intact. Holmes unrolled it across the desk. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The ink, though faded, was legible. I read over his shoulder. To whom it may concern, I, Eliza Breward, being of sound mind though imperiled soul, set down this record not as testament but as protection. The man who calls himself Mr. Felix Darrow is not who he claims. He holds forged letters of introduction, which I was foolish enough to verify too late. In his possession is a deed of trust bearing my name, signed, yes, but under duress. I fear he intends to defraud the society. Should I perish unexpectedly, I charge this record to expose him and revoke his claim. The seal he forced me to break was not mine to disturb. May Providence protect the truth. E.B. We stood in silence as the meaning settled around us like settling dust. Holmes read it twice more, lips tight. Darrow, he muttered, a name I've not encountered in years. Who is he? I asked. Holmes walked to the bookshelf, scanning a volume of court archives. If this document is true, and I have little reason to doubt it, he is a confidence man of considerable talent, one who disappeared from legal records after a fraud trial in 1859. Allegations tied to colonial land holdings, forged inheritances, and shell trusts. He was never convicted. The case collapsed. Miss Lyle's expression darkened. And you believe he targeted my grandmother? Not only targeted her, Holmes said, it appears he used her signature, under threat, to assume control of something significant, something referred to only as the society. What society? I asked. That, Watson, is the question that must now define our inquiry. Holmes immediately began copying the parchment by hand, exact in his lettering and spacing. I watched him work with the precision of a mapmaker charting unknown territory. Watson, I'll need you to take this copy to my solicitor, Mr. Gilworth, in the morning. Instruct him to place it in protected holding and prepare an affidavit affirming its authenticity. I shall retain the original for now. If there is a legacy here, it will not be stolen twice. Miss Lyle was watching Holmes with admiration tinged by confusion. You believe the society still exists? I believe someone connected to it remains active and dangerous. Otherwise, there would have been no need for theatrics in St. Jude's. Someone was warning you away, Miss Lyle. That suggests this affair is far from dormant. Just then, a knock sounded from the downstairs door. Holmes's head snapped toward the hall. He held up a finger, listening. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed faintly, accompanied by another. Male, agitated. Moments later, our landlady opened the sitting-room door. A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent. Very out of breath. Holmes nodded. Show him in. The man who entered was in his 50s, wrapped in a heavy cloak now soaked from the rain. His face was ruddy and round, his spectacles fogged with mist. He carried a black case under one arm and looked about the room with twitching unease. "Mr. Holmes?" he panted. "My name is Basil Trowden. I am a curator with the Ecclesiastical Archives Society." Holmes gestured to the chair. "Sit, Mr. Trowden. Compose yourself." Trowden did so, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "I only just received your message, or I would have come sooner." "My message?" Holmes asked. "Yes. You sent word to our office that you had discovered a record pertaining to a 19th century breach involving one of our benefactors." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "I sent no such message," he said calmly. Trowden blinked. "But I received a note. Delivered by a young boy, said it was urgent. That you had unearthed a sealed declaration from one Eliza Breward." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And what do you know of Miss Breward?" Trowden hesitated. "She was one of our early donors. Minor, really. Made a financial pledge in 1856. Then disappeared from the records. But there were rumors." "What sort of rumors?" "That she had exposed a breach in the Society's books. Funds missing. A private ledger, apparently, was seized from a man named Felix Darrow, but it vanished before any trial could proceed. Some said she hid it. Others said it was destroyed." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then you may be in possession of one piece of the puzzle, Mr. Trowden. We may be holding another." Trowden sat upright. "You have her record. I have something she wrote. But before we discuss it further, you must tell me, who else knows you are here?" "No one," he said. "I came alone." "Why?" Holmes turned to the window, scanning the street below. His voice dropped a register. "Because someone went to great lengths to draw you out. And if they feared what Eliza left behind, they may fear you as well." We all sat in tense silence. Outside, a carriage rattled by, its wheels hissing across the wet cobblestones. But Holmes's eyes remained fixed on the brass tube atop the mantel, as if watching not the object, but the long shadow it cast. Morning brought little relief from the unease that had settled over Baker Street. The rain had ceased, but the sky remained a sullen slate gray. Holmes had slept only a few hours, stretched across the settee with his hands folded beneath his chin and the brass tube perched beside him like a sentinel. I had taken the liberty of accompanying Miss Lyle to a nearby hotel before returning at dawn, only to find Holmes already pacing before the hearth with his usual restless energy. Trowden, the ecclesiastical curator, had remained the night at Holmes's insistence. He now sat in an armchair by the fire, nervously fidgeting with his spectacles. Despite his initial fear, the man had recovered a degree of composure, and Holmes had taken a liking to his precise manner of speech. "Your society," Holmes began, "still retains records dating back to the 1850s? "We do," said Trowden, nodding, "though many are fragmented. The Darrow affair is referenced in only the vaguest of terms. There was a locked ledger, never recovered. Supposedly, it held evidence of false land grants and double pledges issued in the Society's name." Holmes tapped his fingertips together. "And yet no one was ever convicted. The Society was young then. Eager for funding, careless with oversight. If word had gotten out that our early patrons had been duped, well, it might have collapsed the institution before it ever stood on its own feet." Holmes's eyes glinted. "So it was covered up." "Silently retired," Trowden corrected. "The files were buried deep in the archives. We were told never to speak of it publicly." "And yet someone remembered," Holmes murmured, rising to consult his scrapbooks. "Someone remembered enough to lure you here. And someone remembered enough to stage a gunshot in an empty church, in the hope that Miss Lyle might abandon her search." Trowden shifted uncomfortably. "You still believe the shot was meant as a warning?" "Undoubtedly. What's more interesting is that it was not followed by a second attempt. Which tells us two things." Watson Holmes turned toward me, his gaze keen. "First, the person behind it is not impulsive. They act with caution. Second, they were watching. They knew Miss Lyle left without retrieving the tube. But they may not know she returned that night." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And therein lies our advantage. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram. Holmes opened it and scanned the contents, his expression unreadable. "From Gilworth," he said at last. "The copy of Eliza Brewer's declaration has been deposited in a secure legal holding. He's requested an appointment to discuss its implications for any surviving heirs." I glanced toward the mantel. "Then Miss Lyle may have a rightful claim." Holmes raised a brow. "If the declaration holds legal weight, and if the Society's records corroborate it, she may not only be a claimant to funds, but to a scandal buried for nearly 40 years. Troughton looked pale. "If that document reaches the public, then reputations fall, names are questioned, institutions shake," Holmes finished, "which is why someone has already begun to maneuver against it." I moved toward the window and drew back the curtain. "You suspect we're being watched?" "I expect it," Holmes replied calmly. "But that, too, is useful." He turned to Troughton. "Have you, in the course of your work, encountered anyone in the Society particularly interested in its early donors? Researchers, archivists, trustees with a penchant for historical revision?" Troughton hesitated. "There is one. A man named Alaric Venn. He joined the Society 3 years ago. Brilliant, meticulous. But something about him always struck me as theatrical. He requested access to sealed ledgers far beyond his remit. Said he was compiling a history of the Society's philanthropic legacy." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Or perhaps ensuring inconvenient chapters remain unwritten." "I denied his request," Troughton added quickly. "But I suspect he found other means." "Records have vanished. Keys misplaced. I thought it was carelessness." "Not carelessness," Holmes said. "Curation of truth. Mr. Venn may be our shadow." By midday, Holmes had summoned a cab and arranged for Troughton to return to the Society, with instructions to retrieve all files referencing Felix Darrow, Eliza Brewer, or any suspicious pledges issued in the 1850s. "Do so quietly," he warned. "If Mr. Venn is watching, he must not suspect we're on to him." After Troughton departed, Holmes turned to me with that peculiar gleam which always signaled the next stage in his hunt. "Watson, we must pay a visit to Miss Lyle." "But not for conversation." "Then for what?" "For bait." We arrived at the hotel shortly past 2 o'clock. Miss Lyle greeted us in the lobby, a novel clutched in her hand, though her expression betrayed how little reading she'd done. She led us to her room on the 2nd floor, where Holmes gestured for me to close the curtains. "You are being watched, Miss Lyle," he said gently, "though I cannot yet confirm by whom. What I require is your cooperation in leading them to believe you've made a grave mistake." Her brow furrowed. "What sort of mistake?" "You will leave the hotel this evening with a sealed envelope. Plain, nothing written. You will carry it conspicuously. You will then deposit it in the hands of a courier outside Charing Cross Station at precisely 6 o'clock. "What will the envelope contain?" "A blank sheet of paper," Holmes said, "but our watcher will assume it holds the declaration." She looked uncertain, but nodded. "And where will you be?" "In the crowd," he replied, "watching to see who follows whom." At 6 sharp, she performed the task flawlessly. Holmes and I observed from a discreet distance across the street, eyes scanning the passing figures in the rain-slicked crowd. For several minutes, no one moved with particular interest. Then, a man stepped from a lamplit doorway and began walking behind her. He was tall, thin, and impeccably dressed, with a walking cane he did not seem to need. His movements were deliberate, his gaze fixed. Holmes tapped my shoulder. "There," he murmured. "No hat. Black coat. That's not the gait of coincidence." We followed as the man trailed Miss Lyle down the Strand, then abruptly turned east, disappearing through a narrow alley near Southampton Street. Holmes quickened his pace. When we reached the corner, the alley was empty. "Clever," Holmes muttered. "He's made us." "You think he knew we were watching?" "He knew someone was. Which means we were right about the envelope." I looked up and down the alley. "Shall we pursue him?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. He won't vanish. Men like Venn never do. They orbit what they fear." He turned away from the alley and gave a single, quiet chuckle. Tonight, Watson, the hunter knows he's being hunted. And I dare say he's not enjoying the experience. The following morning, Holmes was in one of his moods. Silent, coiled, and deep in thought. He stood at the window of our Baker Street sitting room, unmoving except for the occasional motion of fingers drumming against the sill. The copy of Eliza Brewett's declaration lay unopened beside him, though I knew he had already committed its every word to memory. I'd long learned that conversation in these intervals was unwelcome. Instead, I contented myself with my breakfast and the morning paper, which reported nothing of interest, no arrests, no disturbances, no mention of any American heiress or empty churches. The world, as usual, remained stubbornly unaware of the storm gathering in the margins. It was just past 10 when a knock at the door roused Holmes from his reverie. He answered it himself, and to my surprise, Troughton entered, looking significantly less harried than before. The curator carried a leather-bound folder under his arm and wore an expression that blended triumph with unease. "I found something," he said, taking a seat without being asked. 3 ledgers from 1857, mislabeled and filed behind architectural plans for a cathedral that was never built. I doubt anyone has looked at them in decades. Holmes's eyes lit with interest as Troughton opened the folder and revealed copies of several brittle, yellowing pages. "These," the curator explained, "are financial disbursements, donor receipts, endowment trails, and matching pledges. But here," he pointed to one line, "this entry caught my eye. A payment listed under Felix Darrow's name, endorsed by a trustee, but recorded as coming from E.B. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A laundering of funds." "More than that," Troughton said. "There are multiple such entries. Small sums, £50, 85, 100, all marked with the same initials, and each followed by a matching withdrawal under Darrow's hand." I leaned in. "How many entries total?" 12, said Troughton, "across 3 ledgers. The final one is dated just 2 weeks before Eliza Brewett's death." Holmes tapped the folder with one long finger. "These are the remnants of a siphoning scheme. He funneled money through her name, either without her knowledge or by coercion, and then redirected it into false trusts." "Precisely," said Troughton. "And the pattern ends when she dies. Or rather, when she disappears." Holmes paced to the hearth and stood a moment in silence. "He must have kept the ledger she mentions in her declaration. The private one. The proof. If we find that, we unravel the scheme." Troughton frowned. "And what if someone else already has?" Holmes turned slowly. "Then they will not stop at one warning shot." A chill passed through the room, though the fire burned bright. "I have reason to believe," Holmes continued, "that Mr. Alaric Venn, your colleague, is either descended from Darrow or acting in the interest of those who were. His behavior fits the pattern, quietly excising history, reshaping records, positioning himself close to the oldest rot. But he cannot risk exposure. Not until he finds the missing ledger. You think he believes Miss Lyle has it? He suspects she has something. The fake message sent to Troughton, the tailing at Charing Cross. These are tests, but he does not know we are aware of him." Holmes moved to his desk and retrieved a folded map of London. He circled several locations. "Watson, this afternoon we shall divide our efforts. You'll accompany Mr. Troughton to the Society's annex at Bishopsgate. Look for any storage contracts, off-site archive references, or acquisition notes tied to Darrow's name." I nodded. "And you?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "I'm going to pay Mr. Venn a visit." It was well past 3 when Holmes returned. He was drenched to the shoulders from a sudden downpour, but he removed his coat with a curious lightness. I had only just returned myself, bearing little success from the annex. Troughton and I had uncovered a few aged donor rosters and some curious gaps in inventory, but nothing damning. "Venn is precisely what I expected," Holmes said, shaking off his gloves. "Too polite by half. Invited me in, poured tea, smiled like a cat before the hearth. But he was rattled. I saw it in his eyes when I mentioned Eliza Brewett. He knows the name? He knows more than he's willing to admit. He denied any knowledge of Darrow, said the name appeared in no active records. But his desk, Watson? Ah, that told another tale. He had a directory open to the B's. Not the current ledger, but one of the older hand-bound editions. He closed it too quickly. You believe he's looking for something specific? Not what? Where Holmes opened a small notebook and drew a quick sketch of the page he had glimpsed. There was a listing for an external storage facility, one of the old vaults used by the Society's predecessor institution, the Brotherhood of St. Castulus. It was absorbed in 1848. The address is still legible. Do you think the missing ledger is there? I think, Holmes said, that Venn is gambling on it. He turned to me, all weariness replaced by purpose. Tonight, we go ahead of him. The Brotherhood vault was located beneath a disused chapel in Limehouse, one of those forgotten corners of the city where soot and rain had eroded history into rubble. The chapel itself was padlocked, its windows boarded. But Holmes had anticipated as much and brought with him a set of tools suited to the task. It took us only minutes to breach the side door and descend the damp stone stairwell into the crypt below. The air was thick with mildew and the scent of rusted iron. Our lanterns cast long shadows against brick walls covered in peeling plaster and old ecclesiastical carvings. The vault, when we found it, was little more than a narrow corridor flanked by iron lockers. Most had been emptied or collapsed from damp, but at the far end, one stood untouched, its hinges rusted but its seal unbroken. Holmes examined the latch. Not disturbed in decades. He pried it open, and inside, amid scraps of linen and half-rotted paper, was a wooden case. Within the case, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed in wax, was a ledger, a thick one, bound in faded blue leather and fastened with an iron clasp. Holmes held it up to the light, his expression unreadable. "Property of Felix Darrow," he read aloud. "Private accounts." He turned to me. "This, Watson, is the blade behind the veil. We now hold the truth, a faint noise behind us, too soft to be an echo, too deliberate to be vermin." Holmes's face tensed. He closed the ledger, tucked it into his coat, and whispered, "We're not alone." The faint scuff of movement behind us was not repeated, but Holmes's body had already gone rigid with alertness. The lantern in my hand flickered slightly as I shifted my stance, turning toward the shadows at the mouth of the crypt corridor. Nothing moved. No breath, no figure. Just the oppressive silence of damp stone and forgotten things. Holmes motioned for quiet, his fingers poised mid-air like a conductor waiting to strike the first note. We stood utterly still for a full minute, listening. Then, with the stealth of a panther, he moved toward the archway, every footstep placed with surgical precision. I followed several paces behind, heart thudding in my ears, revolver now drawn but held low. The archway gave way to a side chamber, smaller, filled with crates and rotting hymnals stacked against the wall. A patch of disturbed dust lay at the threshold. Holmes crouched and touched the floor, lifting his fingers to the lantern light. "Fresh. Within minutes," he whispered. We were followed. I scanned the far end of the chamber, but there was no second exit. "Then where did he go?" Holmes rose slowly. "Not far. He knows the crypt better than we do. He's watching, listening. What now?" We leave. Quietly. As though we found nothing, Holmes slipped the Darrow ledger deeper into his coat and covered it with his scarf. With practiced calm, we retraced our steps back toward the stairwell. I was keenly aware of every echo, every soft creak of boots on stone. As we neared the chapel door above, Holmes paused and turned abruptly. "Wait." He crouched again, this time near the wall just below the stairs turn. There, half concealed by the masonry, was a thin thread of wire, taut and gleaming faintly in the lantern light. "A tripwire," he murmured. "Crude but effective. Step through without noticing, and I dare say the entire stairwell would have come down on us." "Booby-trapped?" I asked, startled. "Indeed. The hunter intended to become an executioner if we tried to flee in haste." Holmes followed the wire to a small metal cylinder wedged between bricks. With utmost care, he used a folding blade to sever the wire, then removed the device, wrapping it in cloth and placing it in his pocket. No explosives, he confirmed, but enough tension to bring loose masonry crashing down. Ingenious in its simplicity. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted a cave-in. Once outside, we walked briskly along the empty Limehouse streets until we reached the main thoroughfare. The moment we found a cab, Holmes gave the driver an address in South Kensington, not Baker Street, to my surprise. "We're not going home?" I asked. "Not with this," he said, patting the ledger beneath his coat. "We may have outmaneuvered our watcher for the moment, but if he suspects we hold the records, he will try again, more directly next time. And Kensington, a safe house of sorts, an associate from my earlier work with the Foreign Office. Discreet, cautious, and seldom curious. We'll examine the ledger there." The house was a tall, narrow structure tucked beside a disused mews. The man who received us, an elderly fellow with a thick mustache and a hearing aid, said nothing, simply nodded and showed us into a study lined with outdated encyclopedias and cricket trophies. Holmes set the ledger on the table and bolted the door behind us. The ledger, once unwrapped, gave off a faint scent of mildew and age. Its pages were thick and handwritten in a cramped, angular script. Holmes and I worked through it together, annotating each entry with slips of paper. Within the first dozen pages, it was clear the ledger contained not only the names of individuals defrauded by Felix Darrow, but also those who had participated in the scheme. Clergymen, minor bureaucrats, even one colonial magistrate. "There are over 60 names here," I said, stunned. "Some still alive, no doubt." Holmes nodded grimly. "This is the map of a conspiracy, Watson. It began with Eliza Breward, but it did not end there. Darrow used her name as a gateway, then moved through the city like rot in wood. Matching grants, forged pledges, even land deeds across the Atlantic. He had assistants. This ledger names them, which means it also endangers anyone who holds it." Holmes paused at a particular page. "Here, look at this." Entry deferred. Original copy delivered to the Society Archive, to be bound under revised patronage index. Reference initials A.V. My brow furrowed. A V. Holmes stared at the page a moment longer, then closed the book slowly. Alaric Venn. He didn't just seek the truth, he already found it, years ago. This ledger wasn't lost to him. He knew its location and allowed it to remain hidden. He was buying time, altering history quietly, piece by piece, so that when the truth emerged, it would lack the force to do damage. But then why follow us? Why attempt to stop Miss Lyle? "Because something changed," Holmes said. "Perhaps Miss Lyle's arrival threatened to unearth what he hadn't yet rewritten. Or perhaps the declaration, her grandmother's written record, was the one element he could not control." I stood slowly. "Then Venn is no longer just a suppressor of history. He's a man with motive and opportunity." Holmes met my gaze. "And we now have the means to expose him." He reached for his notebook and jotted down a list. "Tomorrow, we'll see Gilworth again. With this ledger and the declaration, we can initiate a formal inquiry. If even a portion of these entries holds up under scrutiny, Venn will not only lose his position, he'll face criminal charges." He paused, expression darkening. "But we must move carefully. He won't allow this to unfold without retaliation. And if he set a trap in that crypt, I suspect the next will be far less forgiving." A knock at the front door echoed faintly through the house. Holmes's head lifted. "Expecting someone?" I asked. He shook his head. "No." Another knock, firmer this time. Holmes crossed to the window and peered through the drapes. "Too short for Lestrade," he muttered. "Too lean for Gilworth. Come, Watson." We approached the door cautiously. Holmes opened it a crack. On the stoop stood a young boy, no older than 12, shivering in the cold with an envelope in his hand. "Message, sir," he said. "Said it was urgent." Holmes accepted it and opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the note once, then a second time. He handed it to me. She will vanish, as her grandmother did, if you pursue this further. The ledger has teeth, but I have hands. V. Holmes held the envelope between two fingers as though it carried the taint of arsenic. The boy who delivered it had already darted down the steps and disappeared into the haze of the mews. We stood in silence for several moments, the ink still drying on the warning scrawled inside. She will vanish, as her grandmother did, I read aloud again. So Venn intends not merely to silence the evidence, but to remove the air. Holmes's face was unreadable. The threat is as theatrical as it is calculated. He assumes we will panic, retreat, or act rashly. I stepped toward the table where the ledger remained, its leather cover now marked faintly with moisture from Holmes's damp coat. What of Miss Lyle? She must be warned. She must be protected, Holmes corrected, but not in the obvious manner. If Venn has her movements watched, any sudden change will signal fear, and fear, to a man like him, is encouragement. He turned sharply. We must get her out of London. Discreetly. More than discreetly, he said. Convincingly. I want Venn to believe she remains precisely where she is. Holmes moved quickly then, sketching a note and sealing it in wax. I'll send Wiggins and his boys to the hotel. Miss Lyle will be escorted to a safe house near Harrow-on-the-Hill under a false name. Meanwhile, her room at the hotel will remain occupied by someone Venn will mistake for her at a distance. I arched a brow. Your network expands daily. Necessity is the mother of subterfuge, he replied with a thin smile. He paused only to scribble an additional instruction before dispatching a messenger. And now, Watson, it is time we had a word with Lestrade. We arrived at Scotland Yard just before midday, finding the inspector at his desk, glasses perched on the end of his nose and a sheaf of reports stacked to his elbows. He looked up with a grunt of recognition. I'd wager you're not here to confess a crime, Holmes. No, Holmes said smoothly, but I intend to assist you in preventing one. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. It sounds like one of your riddles. Holmes set the ledger on the desk with a satisfying thud. This book contains the names of men and women who participated in a financial conspiracy over 40 years ago. One of those names belongs to a man still active, Alaric Venn, archivist for the Ecclesiastical Archives Society. Lestrade peered at the cover. And you're sure it's authentic? Holmes nodded. It is corroborated by a signed statement from a victim, Eliza Breward, and records retrieved by a society curator. Venn has been altering institutional history to bury this evidence. He also arranged an attempt on my life last night. Lestrade leaned back in his chair, stroking his mustache. You'll forgive me, Holmes, but this doesn't yet cross into criminal court. Fraud older than half the men in this building, no direct accusation, and no current breach of law. Holmes reached into his coat and produced the booby-trap trigger wire, still wrapped in cloth. No current breach? He asked. This was laid to kill or maim. It was found in a crypt beneath Limehouse after Venn followed us and planted a tripwire to bring the ceiling down. Lestrade squinted. And witnesses? None. That is Venn's strength. He orchestrates from the shadows. Well, Lestrade said, if he's as clever as you say, he'll not step into the light easily. You want me to arrest him on theory? I want you to lean, Holmes said, publicly and with purpose. Interview him at his office. Request his records. Ask whether he's aware of Eliza Breward's declaration. Put his name in a report. Rattle his piece. Lestrade considered for a moment, then nodded. Very well. I can rattle a cage as well as the next man, Holmes inclined his head. But mind you do not underestimate him. He is not merely hiding the truth, he is weaponizing it. We left Scotland Yard shortly thereafter. Holmes did not speak for several blocks, his face drawn in that peculiar way he wore when the chessboard of London began to shift beneath his feet. When he did speak, it was as though continuing a conversation we had not yet begun. He'll act quickly now. Lestrade's interest will drive him to desperation. Do you expect him to strike at us? Not directly, Holmes replied. Not yet. But he will attempt to recover the ledger or destroy it. Failing that, he will turn to removing witnesses. Miss Lyle is safest out of sight, but we must now bait a final move. You mean trap him? Something more delicate than that. Venn has survived by intuition, by predicting the actions of others and staying one move ahead. We must give him an opening too perfect to resist. Holmes hailed a cab and gave the driver instructions to take us to the Ecclesiastical Archives Society. The building, a grand but decaying structure on the north end of Lincoln's Inn Fields, bore the marks of faded opulence: high arched windows, dusty marble columns, and a bell pull that groaned with age. Inside, we were met by a clerk who led us to a vestibule lined with portraits of forgotten benefactors. Holmes passed his card, requesting an immediate audience with Mr. Venn. The clerk looked uncertain, but vanished down the corridor. "He'll come," Holmes said. "Curiosity is the chink in every strategist's armor." 10 minutes later, Alaric Venn entered. He was tall and thin, as described. His hair slicked back, his spectacles round and pristine. His mouth was small and his voice smaller still. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson. To what do I owe the honor?" Holmes smiled disarmingly. "We've just come from Scotland Yard." "Have you?" Venn's expression did not change. "I imagine you're stirring some antiquated pot." "We came across a curious document," Holmes continued, "that references your initials. In an archived storage ledger, dated 20 years ago," Venn blinked. "Just once. I doubt that's possible. My tenure began more recently. Perhaps an ancestor," Holmes suggested. "Felix Darrow, for instance." Venn's lip twitched, a tremor so small it might have been imagined. "I believe I've heard the name in passing," he said, "though I fail to see the relevance." "We may wish to ask you more formally," Holmes said, "should Lestrade's investigation proceed." Venn inclined his head. "Then I shall make myself available." We departed without further exchange, though Holmes left a folded copy of Eliza's declaration on the table behind us, placed just so it would catch Venn's eye. As we reached the steps, I turned to Holmes. "You meant to provoke him." "Not provoke," Holmes said. "Corner." That evening, Holmes stood at the fireplace with his violin tucked beneath his chin, playing a somber, meandering melody that wandered like mist through the corners of the sitting room. The music was less of a performance than thought, made sound, fragmentary, unresolved, and deeply introspective. I sat nearby, rereading the declaration left by Eliza Breward and the growing notes we had compiled over the past week. The fire crackled softly, but the tension in the room was taut as piano wire. "He's not going to wait long," Holmes murmured without looking up. "The declaration copy on his desk will be viewed as an act of war." I nodded. "Do you expect retaliation?" "Retaliation, yes, but more likely he will make it appear as containment. He cannot afford to be seen striking, so he'll attempt to silence through obliqueness. A theft, a fire, a disappearance." "Then we move first," I said. Holmes stopped playing, turned and smiled faintly. "Just so? But we cannot rely on legal pressure alone. Lestrade's involvement has rattled Venn, but the law moves slowly, and he knows it. No, Watson, it is time for a final maneuver." He set the violin down and crossed to the writing desk. "You recall how Miss Lyle was escorted to Harrow-on-the-Hill?" "Of course. She remains safe and unaware of this morning's threat. But tonight, we'll let Venn believe otherwise." He penned a brief note, folded it, and tucked it into an envelope marked with Miss Lyle's hotel crest. Then he wrote a second letter, this one addressed to a Mr. Thaddeus Gill, an antiquarian bookseller in Whitechapel with a reputation for transactions that straddled the boundary of legitimacy. "What are you planning?" I asked. "To suggest, through calculated leaks, that Miss Lyle intends to sell the ledger to a foreign legal firm interested in prosecuting cross-jurisdictional fraud." He handed me the second letter. "This will be delivered anonymously to Gill's assistant. Gossip will do the rest. Venn will hear of it by morning, and he'll act. He'll have to. He believes the ledger is the key to his downfall. If it's sold, he loses control entirely. He'll move to intercept it, but he must believe it's in Miss Lyle's possession. I saw the shape of it then. So you're giving him an irresistible target? Holmes nodded. And when he comes to claim it, we'll be waiting. The bait was set in motion that night. Wiggins and his companions spread whispers at 3 different clubs and left planted letters with clerks who would never admit receiving them. By midnight, the name Breward was already circulating in quiet corners of Fleet Street, and by dawn, an envelope had been delivered to the office of Mr. Gilworth, our solicitor. The handwriting was precise and anonymous, its contents a simple ultimatum. Cease all action relating to the Breward estate or face legal injunction and public scrutiny. There are no heirs. There is no claim. Gilworth forwarded it immediately, baffled but undeterred. Holmes read it once and smiled. He's panicking. Good. Now we must ensure he panics in the direction we want. That afternoon, we returned to Miss Lyle's hotel. Her room remained occupied by one of Holmes's agents, disguised well enough to pass for her at a glance. As expected, a man had been seen loitering near the corridor that morning. Tall, dark coat, wearing gloves despite the warming weather. When asked by hotel staff, he claimed to be waiting for a telegram. Holmes asked for a sketch of the man's face, and once produced, he compared it against a sketch he himself had made days earlier. "Ven's valet," he said, "travels under the name Edmund Hale. Loyal, silent, and quite possibly dangerous." "And if he's here," I said, "then Ven is nearby." Holmes did not answer. He stood by the window, gazing across the narrow street where the opposite building held a view of the hotel's entrance. After a moment, he raised his hand. There. A figure stood at an upper window. Briefly, then was gone. It was only a silhouette, but unmistakably tall and thin, with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to observing without being seen. "He's watching the bait," Holmes said, "and now we deliver the hook." We left instructions with the concierge that Miss Lyle would be departing that evening with a valise in hand and would require a cab to Charing Cross. The valise, of course, would contain only books, cleverly bound copies of case, notes and blank parchment. As the false Miss Lyle descended the hotel steps at 7, Holmes and I waited in a cab a block away. The street was unusually quiet. She entered the carriage and departed. We followed in ours, keeping at a discreet distance. Halfway to the station, just as the cab reached a narrow junction near Fleet Street, a second cab overtook it from behind and drew alongside. "There," I said, pointing. "2 men inside. I saw them." Holmes tapped the driver's roof. "Faster. Stay close, but unseen." We followed both cabs into the twisting veins of the city until they reached a quieter side street near Middle Temple Lane. There, the second cab veered across the first, cutting it off. The driver leapt down and opened the door. One of the passengers emerged, Edmund Hale. From the alley behind them stepped a third man, Alaric Venn. Holmes gripped my arm. He came himself. "What now?" "Now," he said, "we confront him with the truth and the trap." Before Venn could reach the carriage, Holmes stepped into view. "Mr. Venn," he called. Venn froze, as did Hale. Holmes strode forward with calculated calm, hands raised in easy neutrality. "I wonder," he said, "what story you intended to tell when your valet pulled a woman from this carriage? That she was absconding with stolen documents, that she had forged an identity. You'd have tied up every loose thread. Neatly." Venn's voice was quiet. "You orchestrated this." "I merely allowed you to act freely," Holmes replied. "Your instinct did the rest." Holmes gestured, and from the opposite alley stepped 2 plainclothes officers, Lestrade's men, waiting under his instruction. A third stepped out behind Hale, revolver drawn. Venn's mouth twisted. "You have no proof," he hissed. Holmes drew a folded document from his coat. "Your own hand betrayed you. This letter, delivered to our solicitor, bears the same stylistic fingerprints as your private correspondence, which Mr. Trowden retrieved this morning. An archivist leaves traces, Mr. Venn. That is your weakness." Venn glanced at Hale, then back at Holmes. "You think this ends here?" Holmes's gaze was cold. "It does. For you, the officers stepped forward. Venn did not resist. He merely straightened his coat as though attending a funeral in which he was both mourner and corpse. As he was led away, Holmes turned to me. The ledger will reach the proper hands. And the past, Watson, will no longer whisper. It will testify. The morning after Alaric Venn's arrest broke across London in subdued tones. There were no headlines, no ink spilt on the front page of any paper. The name of the Ecclesiastical Archives Society remained unsullied in public record, just as Holmes predicted. But within the quiet rooms of certain government offices, letters were already being penned, trustees summoned, and inquiries prepared with a discreet thoroughness that only accompanied scandal wearing silk gloves. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat at the breakfast table not with his customary disdain for morning rituals, but with a rare sense of quiet satisfaction. He buttered his toast with surgical precision, as though each movement brought finality to a long unfolding equation. "It will not make the papers," he said, as though reading my thoughts. "Nor will it be whispered in the House of Commons. But make no mistake, Watson, this is the sort of crime that echoes not in courts, but in committees." I nodded. "And yet the consequences will ripple." "Indeed," he replied. "The ledger will be audited by private inquiry. Some names will resign quietly. Others will claim ignorance and be allowed to fade. Venn, however, it will not find it so forgiving. He'll face trial." Holmes's gaze turned distant, perhaps. "But more likely, he will be buried beneath institutional shame, a clerk reassigned, a position dissolved. He will vanish the way the records he altered were meant to vanish." Miss Florence Lyle arrived later that morning, her journey from Harrow completed without incident. She entered our sitting room with a measured calm, though her eyes darted quickly toward the desk, where the Darrow ledger now sat secured within a leather satchel. "I saw the man's face as they took him," she said after a moment. "He looked at me as though I were interrupting something he had earned." Holmes gestured for her to sit. "Men like Venn often convince themselves they are guardians of order. Their crimes become acts of preservation in their own minds. It is not conscience they lack. It is humility." She exhaled slowly. "Will it be enough what we've done? Will the truth matter to anyone?" "It mattered to you," Holmes said softly. "That alone justifies the effort." She looked at him for a long moment, then offered a small, grateful smile. "My grandmother would have liked you." "That may be the highest compliment I've received all month," he replied, with a faint upward curl of the lips. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded paper. "I thought you should see this." It was among the letters in the bottom of her fan's case. "I missed it until last night." Holmes opened it delicately. The ink had faded, but the script was unmistakably Eliza Brewer's. It was not a legal document, but something gentler, a personal letter. It read, in part, "To the child I will never meet, know that truth is not a weapon, but a lantern. The man who betrayed me did so not for gold, but for the illusion of power. May you find more comfort in clarity than I did in silence. If this letter finds your hands, then perhaps some part of me has found peace." Holmes refolded it silently and returned it. "She never raised her voice," Florence said quietly. "But she raised the alarm all the same." Holmes offered no words in reply, only a nod that carried more weight than language could. "Hold." Later that day, we paid one final visit to Mr. Gilworth, who now held both the original declaration and the authenticated ledger. The solicitor was cautiously optimistic about Florence's claim. "There is precedent," he admitted, "for estates passed in the absence of a will when accompanied by posthumous declarations. It will not be simple, but the evidence is compelling, and Mr. Holmes's testimony carries considerable weight." Florence asked only that the church not fight it. "I'm not interested in retribution," she said, "only recognition, that she existed, that she warned them, that she mattered." Holmes smiled slightly at that. "Then I suspect your grandmother's final wish may yet be honored." On our return to Baker Street, we found Lestrade awaiting us. He was seated in Holmes's armchair with the familiar blend of discomfort and curiosity he always brought with him into our rooms. "I've come to return something," he said, rising and producing a small metal cylinder, the tripwire device Holmes had disarmed beneath the chapel in Limehouse. It was examined and deemed amateur but clever, and dangerous enough to ensure charges against Venn will include intent to harm. "Let's hope he doesn't claim it was all a misunderstanding," I said dryly. "He won't," Lestrade replied. "He's been unusually quiet in holding. No lawyer, no letters, just sits and stares. We think he expected this in some twisted way, like he rehearsed for his own downfall. He likely did," Holmes said. His mind was too tidy to allow for improvisation. When chaos finally came, it broke him. Lestrade gave a grunt of reluctant admiration. "You always find the mad ones, Holmes." "I find the hidden ones," Holmes corrected. "There is a difference." As evening fell, Holmes returned once more to his violin. The tension had lifted, but the air still carried the weight of consequence. I poured myself a brandy and settled by the fire, watching him play, not with the sharp, plucked precision of earlier days, but something softer, something with resolution at its center. I found myself reflecting on all that had passed, the empty church echoing with a phantom gunshot, the parchment sealed in a tomb, the woman crossing oceans to resurrect a truth nearly lost to time. It was not the kind of case that would ever reach headlines. But it mattered, and in its own quiet way it had altered the lives of those who refused to be erased. As the final note of Holmes's melody faded into the lamplight, he set the bow down and looked to me. "You know, Watson," he said, "sometimes the most elaborate crimes are not committed to steal but to hide, not to gain, but to preserve a lie." "And yet," I replied, "they unravel all the same." Holmes gave a rare smile, one not touched by irony or triumph, but by something that could almost be called peace. "Yes," he said, "they do." The spring rain returned to London in slow, persistent rhythms, coating the window panes of 221B Baker Street with a gloss that turned the street beyond into a watercolor wash. It had been 3 days since Alaric Venn's arrest, and though the city continued with its usual thrum, clocks striking, cabs rattling, passers-by clutching their umbrellas, our rooms held an uncommon quiet. Holmes had scarcely left his armchair since morning. He sat with his long fingers folded beneath his chin, eyes closed, not in slumber, but in thought. It was a posture I had come to associate not with idleness, but with the delicate work of sorting conclusions from instincts, weighing the final threads before tying off a case. I was reviewing a draft of my written summary, careful as always not to overstate my own contributions. The Darrow ledger lay nearby, now wrapped in fresh cloth and entrusted to Mr. Gilworth's firm for safekeeping. The declaration of Eliza Breward had been notarized and accepted into preliminary legal review. All outward steps had been taken, and yet I sensed Holmes felt something unresolved. He spoke at last, eyes still closed. "Tell me, Watson, what do you think the true motive was?" "For the conspiracy?" I asked. "For the silencing," he said. I thought a moment. To protect the institution. To avoid a scandal, to erase the breach before anyone could follow it, Holmes opened his eyes and looked toward the hearth. "So it would seem. But I believe Venn's motives ran deeper. He did not merely wish to prevent exposure, he wished to control it. He inherited the deception and, in time, saw himself as the steward of its legacy. You think he believed it was his duty?" Holmes nodded. "The irony of archivists, Watson. They preserve truth but curate memory. Venn could not destroy the past, so he sought to edit it." I rose and poured us each a cup of tea, handing one to Holmes without a word. He accepted it with a small nod and sipped absently. "There's another detail," he said. "One that still troubles me." "What is that?" "The shot fired in St. Jude's," he said. "We know it was intended as a warning. But what if it also served another purpose?" I furrowed my brow. "You suspect a second motive?" Holmes set his cup down and reached for the file we had compiled. He opened to a sketch of the church's interior, which he had drawn during our first visit. He tapped the map. The shot was fired near the altar, correct? But from the angle of the powder residue, it was aimed low, toward the floor, not the ceiling or pews. I nodded. That was your assessment, yes. And yet, Holmes continued, no one reported damage. No impact mark. Nothing disturbed. So what do you believe? He leaned forward. I believe the shot may have been aimed at something specific. Perhaps a loose tile, a sealed compartment, something beneath the altar. But we already found the declaration, I said. And the ledger was hidden elsewhere. True, Holmes said, but Venn's behavior suggested he remained searching for something. I wonder if he believed Eliza Brew had left more behind than we recovered. There was a knock at the door before I could respond. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a tray. Holmes opened it and read silently, then passed it to me. Ledger examined, several entries coded with letters not yet deciphered. Believe more records may remain sealed at St. Jude's. Gilworth. Holmes was on his feet before I finished reading. Watson, your coat. We must return to the church. We arrived at St. Jude's shortly before dusk. The verger, Mr. Enfield, was waiting with keys in hand, clearly flustered but cooperative. He led us inside, his lantern casting long shadows across the stone floor. No disturbances since your last visit, Mr. Holmes, he said, but I admit I haven't been near the altar since. That is where we'll begin, Holmes replied. The sanctuary smelled of old incense and stone dust. Holmes examined the altar's base, tapping along the tiles with the butt of his walking stick. He paused when he reached a discolored slab near the front. Here, he murmured. Watson, your blade. I handed him my penknife, and he worked delicately along the tile's edge. After a minute, it lifted, revealing a shallow recess lined with velvet that had long since faded to gray. Inside sat a leather-bound folio, narrower than the ledger, and sealed with black ribbon. Holmes lifted it reverently. Not financial, personal. He opened it slowly. Inside were pages of letters, some addressed to Eliza Breward from clerics, others bearing her own hand. There were confessions, warnings, and 2 pages written in cipher. Holmes's eyes moved rapidly across the texts. This, he said, was her shadow archive. A parallel record. She knew the society would deny her voice. So she left this beneath the altar, in the very heart of what had failed her. We returned to Baker Street with the folio secured in Holmes's case. He spent the next several hours examining the cipher, which he cracked with predictable ease. The encrypted entries detailed meetings between Darrow and other officials, notes on financial diversions, and, most damning of all, a letter of complicit approval from a high-ranking member of the society whose name still sat on the current board. This changes the weight of the ledger, Holmes said. It no longer suggests fraud, it proves conspiracy. The next morning, Gilworth accepted the folio with a grave expression. Legal processes would now move swiftly, and the institution that had quietly buried its scandal would be forced to unearth its own rot. As for Florence Lyle, she received the final news with a bittersweet stillness. It will not bring her back, she said, but it gives her story an ending. One the world can read, Holmes stood beside the window, watching the rain strike the glass. She wrote for no audience, yet her truth remained intact. That Miss Lyle is rare and powerful. Before she departed, she turned to Holmes. Do you believe she knew it would reach me? Holmes offered no definitive answer. She hoped. And sometimes hope is enough to leave behind a lantern, even if the path is dark. After she had gone, I sat beside the fire, notebook open, but pen still. Holmes returned to his chair, legs crossed, fingers steepled in silent thought. I dare say, I said, that this case will not fade from memory as easily as others. Holmes's smile was faint, because it began with an echo and ended with a voice.